happy to be here. So we're all here to kind of celebrate and talk about institutions and ideas that are thousands of years old. But at the same time, we're swimming in a universe of technology that no one could have envisioned, let alone thousands of years ago, perhaps even a couple of decades ago. So one of the things I'd like to explore with the panel today is how advanced technology, AI, metaverse, social media, and all of this, in what ways it can promote democracy, but in what ways can it also be used as a weapon to undermine it. And why don't we start first with Carola. Let's talk about the metaverse, which maybe some of you have had the chance to try some of the tools out there to see what it's like. But let me open this question with what is the thing that perhaps is most hopeful about it in terms of promoting democracy, and what is the thing that we should worry most about in terms of its undermining democracy?
I hope everybody can hear me. Yes?
Yep.
Good. Thank you, Pat. So maybe I'd like to take just a little step back and introduce myself. In my role at Meta, I lead outreach for government and political institutions, predominantly in Southern Europe. And what we do is we have conversations with policymakers around our products, how they use them for their work, whether, if it works, if it's not working, and how they're generally thinking about the space. So when it comes to the metaverse, what we're seeing is that there is obviously a big excitement with the technology, with the concept, but also, and understandably so, obviously a lack of understanding yet of what it is and what it's going to be in the future. For example, it's not uncommon for people to ask or to think whether if the metaverse is purely a gaming platform, which of course you can play games in the metaverse, but as I think everybody in this panel knows, it's obviously much more than that, and we're seeing real strong applications come out in fields like education and healthcare. So maybe just so that we're all on the same page, I'd just like to say, so what is the metaverse? The metaverse really is the next generation of the internet. It is an immersive internet. It's going to be more like being inside the internet rather than just experiencing it on 2 dimensions, looking at a flat screen. And this may sound a bit like science fiction at this stage, but it actually is a fairly logical progression of how communication technologies have evolved or are continuing to evolve over the years. If we think about it in just a couple of decades, actually, I think everybody in this room has undergone profound transformation and innovation in the way they communicate with others and with the world around them. And I think we can all go back and see how we've gone from text to photos to videos, from desktop to web to mobile. And the innovation that has driven all of this has partly been the search to make this communication as lifelike as possible in each step of the way, in each of the step of the chain. So what sets the metaverse apart is really this presence, this feeling of presence, of embodied presence, like you are right there next to somebody else, as if you were physically with that person, as if even if you are in different buildings in different countries. And although the full materialization of the metaverse is still years away, as I said, we're already starting to see these incredible applications that have enormous potential for society. So to your question.
Yes, and we want to jump around, so just follow up on that, on democracy.
Yeah. So to your question, I think it's really this, now that we explained it, this feeling of presence, of having access to this feeling of presence that really has tremendous potential for democracy. Everybody today, pretty much everybody can be connected, but not necessarily present. So we can, I can have a Zoom call and see my family in New York on video, but I can't necessarily, hop on a plane and see them. The same way that I can, attend an online course, but I'm never going to get the full experience from that.
So the pandemic has thrust us all into this world of where we're kind of separated and together at the same time, and I think really gave everybody a crash course on some of the benefits of it as well as some of the negatives. But Nana Louise, let me move to you, and just to broaden out not only from the metaverse, but this whole universe of technology. You know, it has incredible potential to kind of, as we were saying, really promote interaction and people being there. But what are some of the dangers that it poses to democracy?
Yeah, thank you for that broad question. And I just want to say, you know, I'm so happy to be here. I think it's an important time to talk about this topic. It's a time where democratic values are challenged, even on our own continent. And I think it's a time to come together and help each other, see if we can, you know, protect our values and protect our democracies. It's a time of change. We are challenged by a war. We are recovering from a pandemic. We have challenges around climate, energy crisis. Our democracies are threatened. And I think technology has a big role to play in trying to find solutions to some of these challenges. So in that way, it can be a tool to protect our democracies and the transparency, the combating of misinformation in different ways. But of course, it can also be a weapon. And we've seen cyber attacks. I worked quite a lot with the Ukrainian government over the last year in protecting the country against cyber attacks. We detected quite a lot of cyber attacks, and Microsoft just issued actually a report on everything that we found and where we helped the government. So I think, you know, it's crucial that we find out, you know, how can we address these threats that technology represents with regulation and with agreements across governments, companies, that will enable us to use technology and gain all the benefits, at the same time address the challenges.
I mean, you brought up this issue of regulation, and so, Kyle, let me take this moment to turn to you, because cyber attacks are something, when I hear about that, it's very terrifying and on a level that I feel I can do nothing about. But, you know, even technology that's, let's say, more accessible, facial recognition, which can be a great, you know, tool for security, but also, as it's sometimes used as we're seeing in China, as a great means of controlling the population. So, Kyle, let me turn to you and ask you from the perspective more of the public, where do you fall out on this?
Well, I think picking up on some of those themes, right, as it relates to democracy, the metaverse, or the constellation of platforms and experiences that make up the metaverse, are value neutral. It's their use and their application and the underlying mechanisms and our kind of own opinion and perception of those that really will kind of color and influence our own understanding of whether or not they're a threat or an undermine or a harm. And so what we've learned in our work, engaging with the public on complex technical issues and technology issues, is that they can handle complexity. The public can handle that and understand the benefits and trade-offs associated with the technology and why or why not it might not be used or applied. But uncertainty and lack of clarity really leads to skepticism and mistrust. And this is a unique situation where applying particular engagement tools might provide an opportunity to really proactively address some of what we perceive as the harms of social media, of technology, as it has impacted democracy in recent years, such as disproportionate harms to communities of color, women, and others who have the fallout from negative attacks and harassment. Really finding a way to get in front of and build a framework both for metaverse experiences internally and frameworks externally that involve the public meaningfully in shaping these issues. So if it's going to be as transformational and affect every aspect of our lives, you know, the public should be involved in shaping what it looks like and how it feels and how it's governed. And I think that's where our perception and our work comes in meaningful ways. And we've demonstrated this on public-private partnerships around artificial intelligence and data sharing platforms and monetization. It can be done, but it has to be done carefully, and it has to be done independently so that it's not, these results and feedback aren't subject to skepticism and criticisms of bias.
Let me just follow up on that, though, particularly in a atmosphere now where there's a lot of distrust of government. How do we walk that line between turning to government as a very much needed regulatory force, as Ana Luisa talked about, but at the same time, the fear of giving the government so much power in terms of control and use of these tools that citizens themselves feel threatened by it?
Well, I would say this really gets into understanding and evaluating the mechanisms that underlie the transactions, the processes that, and the platforms that build the metaverse itself. And so I would think Esther might be able to share something around how independent developers interact with government and broader, larger development and companies to really help shape that. But the role that citizens and the public can play is to be brought into those conversations early so that their input and insights can be meaningfully incorporated into the earlier stages of development rather than trying to retrofit, which we're already seeing isn't working. And that's where processes like the ones that our organization operates can really find a place to meaningfully shape the trajectory of that development.
So that's a perfect, because I was just going to turn to Esther, because to kind of take this conversation from a more abstract to how on the ground you can kind of operationalize some of this. So please talk about that.
Yeah, so we look at the future of learning and work through the lens of Gen Z, under 25s. They are digital native, but they are also increasingly some of the most disenfranchised from democracy. It's a system that is not effectively delivering for them anymore, evidenced by cost of living, inflation, decisions that are taken at a strategic governmental level that have direct consequences for them, but they have no voice. So we look at decentralisation as an effective mechanism for rebuilding some of democracy. These are not conflicting. They're actually very powerful. If you can bring together communities who are disenfranchised, disparate, into more immersive digital spaces, where I think important debate can start to be had again. And I think there is this kind of battle royale between major centralised platforms and this sort of more open metaverse, more transparent, more self-sovereign data, ownership, accountability, education and training, that I think is, as an observer, obviously a participant as well, but as an observer it's a fascinating time. And I think that it presents a huge opportunity for not just kind of the sort of more open, Web3 metaverses, but also, important dialogues with the major centralised platforms like Meta to go, these are not conflicting ideals, they are interoperable, and they can come together, and that can be much, much more beneficial for society.
But except as we've all seen, and when the idea of kind of pushing down control is the essence of democratic thought, and as well as this idea, what you talked about, of ownership. But we've also seen how that can result in kind of insulated communities where there's a lot of misinformation and extreme ideas that get circulated in kind of an echo chamber and actually end up being a very insidious force in democratic society. So, it goes back to this point of, yes, these are tools, but how do we make sure we nudge them in the direction you're talking about and not in another way?
It's hugely challenging because technology has a rampant acceleration. It is privatised, it can move as fast as it needs to, and regulation has always struggled to keep pace with the rate of change. And I think that's the biggest challenge, is how do you activate rapid regulatory frameworks to match the kind of change that is occurring in real time. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges.
Carola, you were going to say
I just wanted to add on both what Carl and Esther were saying. I think we really are at a unique time right now. This opportunity maybe didn't present itself, in the past, where we have both, the technology being developed at a very rapid pace, but we are also starting to have, these conversations from the outset. So this is really a moment in time where both things can go in tandem and feed into each other. So really, there isn't going to be, for instance, a metaverse the same way there isn't a Google internet. It really has to be, if this is to work, interoperable and seamless for everybody, and for this to be, based on rules, norms, and standards where everybody has had the opportunity to contribute. So I think that's, why we're also talking about this at this early stage. We are really in the early days. I mean, this is the dial-up internet stage. So, like, really early days. And I think it's incredibly positive that we're already, getting together across the industry, but not only the industry, also extensive research is being conducted, academia is looking at it from the user's perspective as well. So I think this is truly a unique opportunity that we have right now, and time is really on our side, because the full materialization of this is still years ahead.
It's nice to hear somebody so optimistic in a time when it feels very pessimistic. Nana, please.
And maybe that's then the little negative comment here, not negative, but I think I completely share your view about the openness, but I think we should make sure that we clean up our problems in the old internet before we transfer them also to the metaverse. Privacy, disinformation, I think that's really crucial. I loved your comment about inclusiveness. I think that's going to be key, that we make sure that the technology we build and the rules that we put in place, that they're inclusive, that they make sure that, we embrace every person on the planet, and even disabled people, that they are able to also use technology and benefit from it. Mm-hmm. I also want to just pick up on your comment on distrust of governments. I think that's why, and I hear a common theme here, that that's why we need to come together. Not only technology that should define the regulation, it's not only governments. Yeah, they should be the one regulate in the end, but we need to come together and discuss these really difficult and complex issues, because only together we can find the right balance where we enable all the things that we want to leverage, and at the same time address the threats that we all want to address. So,
Kyle.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the unique opportunities that we have around different types of engagement with the public and with users, consumers, constituents, or citizens, is that by bringing people together to really learn in depth about these before simply asking for their thoughts and reflections or their opinion, right? What we can avoid, or at least have an opportunity to avoid, is the same challenges that have bogged down the privacy debate in the US, for instance. 10 years of survey information has said people care about privacy, but beyond that, it's really useless information. And when you think about the learning curve of what it took for our government in the US to begin even putting forward substantial bills on data privacy, it took the kind of public shaming of the 2019 Senate testimony for people to say, oh, senators really need to get up to speed on this and really understand. And now apply the new level of complexity to metaverse technologies and think about that in the context of our parents or grandparents trying to make sense of this and say, what do we want to think about when it's balancing our own personal experience and enjoyment for leisure or work and potential benefits and commercial gain and all of the underlying kind of interrelated dynamics. It really takes careful thought and consideration about how we structure those conversations and which ones are really opportune for engaging with the public to really help shape, and what are the conditions to make that happen in a really meaningful and positive way. And that's the way that we think about applying these processes towards really complex and sticky issues.
Ana Luis.
No, maybe just really short. There are also other initiatives going on at the moment. The last week at the UNGA, Microsoft launched together with the Copenhagen government, the Danish government, and many of our competitors also and other organizations, Copenhagen Pledge for Democracy, where we have agreed on some areas where we want to work together. We are committed to work on combating disinformation and also making sure to protect our elections. So these are also these initiatives that are a little bit adding on to the traditional government regulation.
How do we balance this idea of having, of course, what we were talking about, representation, cooperation, transparency, in terms of all people working together to come up with a set of rules, but that the process doesn't end up getting so bogged down? I mean, we're seeing now in terms of climate change that, clearly it was a war that prompted a lot of governments to take actions that they've been talking about for 30 years, that the devastation of the planet didn't push them on. And one of the things that has prevented, for instance, some renewable energy sources has been exactly this process of public representation, public, people who don't want, whether it's wind terminals or whatever, in their backyard. So how do we balance these two things?
I look at it from...
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Go ahead, Esther.
I mean, I suppose I'm profoundly and relentlessly optimistic, because the alternative is being miserable and depressed about it all. But I think again, I look at the number of young people globally, that we have the kind of privilege and opportunity of working with, and they are increasingly global citizens, and I think that the more ability to connect, and interconnect, this very, very articulate, intelligent generation, because they have more access to information than we ever had. So this idea that older people know better, and I am an older person, I just don't believe it's true anymore. We're stuck in these old ways of thinking, these old systems, and actually you've got this generation going, can you just get out of the way? Like, you've made a mess, and we've got to clean it up, brah. So I think, that idea that digital platforms, metaverse, space immersive experiences can create this much more global connectivity of people who actually understand that they live on this one planet and they get this one chance. And in many ways, that's why I'm hopeful, because it's almost going like, if we just pave the way and then get out of the way, instead of it all being doom and gloom, maybe there is a more positive future. And maybe that's why, actually that is why I'm in this space. Because I do think, if you have 1 billion young people interconnected, about to see the greatest wealth transference, in a generation, that's kind of exciting.
Nana Louise, were you going to jump in?
No, I would just say, the regulators are calling upon us to help with this challenge. I was in a climate meeting at New York last week, and the climate commissioner Timmermans was having this roundtable and said, I need you to help, because we can make the regulation, but we can not make it happen without your help. So I think increasingly big companies like Microsoft and also other have self-regulated and put some ambitious target, like, for example, our data centers, we will be only with renewable energy by 2025. It's actually pretty soon. Carbon negative by 2030. And so these self-regulation mechanisms, I think, again, it's a topic we need to help each other. And there's, of course, also the hope that technology can help with some of these challenges, that we can build some technological solutions that can help us with the climate challenge as well. But it's not an easy topic.
Carola, did you have a thought on the regulated?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, go back to Esther's point a little bit on, the future generation and, and the optimism behind that. I agree, definitely with you, and I think that, by seeing all of the potential that can come out of this in a very tangible way, so, creators are, can create on their own by themselves, what they want without having to, to stick to old paradigms. And I think this is especially true on immersive learning, which you're very familiar with. We see that, you can learn differently in a much, in a much more efficient way, just by using different tools. So the opportunity that VR, for instance, presents for the study, I mean, recently there was this company that just launched a program on algebra, like an algebra curriculum based on VR, because what research shows is that there is a lot of disengagement coming to STEM generally, and this is because foundational skills like spatial awareness or the ability to abstract yourself, from physicality cannot be developed as, in school traditionally, and those are basic skills, to move on later in those disciplines that are so important then for society. And through these VR programs, students can learn to do that using different tools, and the impact is tremendous. So I think that when we start seeing, and we're already starting to see now, these incredibly positive applications, we'll be able to fully realize the potential that lies beyond. And this is also a source of inspiration and encouragement for this generation.
Kyle, were you going to jump in there?
Well, I think I'd actually like to just hear Esther follow up on that, because it seems so close to your wheelhouse that it would make sense for that first, and then I can come back. Yeah.
I think it's back to democracy, one of the most beautiful examples of the use of AR and VR that I've seen is a prison in the US where these men were sent down when they were children, teenagers. They were handed life sentences in the 60s and 70s, for theft, and so they're institutionalized. And they're using AR and VR to rehabilitate because when they went into prison, ATMs didn't exist. So they enter an alien real world that they don't understand, and so they just go back inside. And the use of AR, VR is reducing offending rates. And so the idea that this technology can give a voice to the voiceless, I think is hugely powerful. I'm not blind to all of the issues that go with it as well. But I do think when you see these use cases, you really start to see the power of what this can do.
And kind of shifting back from the interaction between individual creators and developers and larger centralized platforms, the question of internal controls and self-governance and internal regulation really is important. And I think on the potentially pessimistic side more so is the risk of, particularly around some of these issues, I think is something we might consider democracy washing, of using traditional forms of market research and audience understanding and insights to either sway users or potential users towards potential applications that are in the interest of those who are creating these platforms or processes and experiences, rather than doing something that is far more open and looking to incorporate feedback at earlier stages before the outcomes are predetermined. And we've done projects and work where we've been brought in to help try to understand and assess what are the kind of regulatory and ethical constraints that people want to see around information sharing networks or commercialization of patient health records and other such secondary uses. And it's not as though people are inherently opposed to those, but if it's not purposefully and meaningfully presented as the trade-off between not necessarily competing forces of commercial gain and public benefit, but a real assessment of where is the threshold of balancing those two things for particular applications and uses, then it really runs a risk of looking kind of like asking for thoughts about a decision that's made or something that's been designed and already in the pipeline to utilize, rather than inviting the public into shaping policies, regulations, or systems themselves. That being said, the other side of it is that, Carola, as you mentioned, the whiteboard component, like there's so much open about what the next steps can look like that it doesn't have to look and feel just like the internet as we've experienced it in the past, and it doesn't necessarily have to just replicate the same experiences of echo chambers and other things that have happened, because the possibilities are so much broader and more limitless.
I mean, I'm wondering if any of you have a kind of specific idea of how to actualize this process of transparency and consent. I mean, I know how many times whether it's a financial document or a health record you mentioned, and it's, 17 pages of fine print, and everything is there and, you know, sign at the end, and how many of us ever actually read that and know what we're giving our consent to? You know, how can we, what are very complex issues, how can we make that kind of understanding and consent more meaningful? Esther, I don't know if you've had a thought about this.
So I think, you know, from our side, you know, we you know, dislike the pointless bits of paper, mostly in the form of qualifications and other things. So obviously for us, you know, Hundo is excuse me, built on chain, and the reason for that is that you have a verified, validated record of what you're doing, instead of frantically trying to find, you know, a piece of paper from an A-level or a qualification, you know, in my case about 20 years ago. So I think there is powerful use cases for the simplification of complex things, because actually, in many ways, you could argue those 17 pieces of paper don't protect anybody, because we never read them, we just click consent because we're really busy and we just need to get on. So I think actually evolving that and having a much more verified process, which I think blockchain offers, is one of the, you know, is kind of one of the more interesting use cases that I see.
Kyle?
I happy to share an example. So from our work, one of the questions, or one of the projects that we've done on behalf of a national regulatory and oversight committee, the National Data Guardian in the UK, was to look at the use of patient health records and when it was reasonable to expect that they would be shared beyond your point of care. And we looked at a number of use cases and scenarios where these exchanges were taking place. And what emerged from the process that we ran in collaboration with partners at the University of Manchester and the public was, from the National Data Guardian's perspective, a publicly generated and created concept of what constituted public benefit that they could apply and use as a kind of guidepost for future decisions. So that in and of itself wasn't just about those particular patient X sees a doctor, can it be reasonable to assume consent here? It had a more evergreen kind of component where they could use that to apply to future decision making, and that to us was a strong application that got to some of that. It wasn't clear
I like
consent.
this idea, and I'm curious if it's too complex, but to talk about how you define public benefit, you know, because that seems like something that, you know, would make sense in terms of a standard.
Well, I think what we found in that was particular application for health records and what, when, and where. But I think what would actually be interesting would be to hear from the Meta and Microsoft perspective what kind of constitutes the public benefit that you see around the technologies that you're creating.
So can you repeat the question?
What are some of the aspects that you see in the technologies you're creating where you apply the kind of concept of public benefit to the technologies or the platforms that you're creating? What does that term mean to you in the context of your work?
But is the question coming from like a legal perspective on the consent, or are you talking more about the beneficial application, just to understand?
My interest would be less as from a legalistic perspective, but in terms of, you know, you've both been talking about getting representatives at the table and working with regulators. So, you know, how, from a private company's perspective, do you go about operating in the public interest, in public benefit? How do you make that happen?
So I think there's many different answers to that question, but I can give one example. So for example, on AI technology, one thing that we are promoting is transparency, inclusion, and transparency is, for example, you know, how do you train the algorithm so people can go in and control that it's been you know, inclusive. So you've trained it with, you know, different kind of nationalities and, you know, black and white and yellow, and so that at least you can go in and check what kind of training you gave the algorithm to make sure that it lives up to democratic values and inclusiveness, and it's fair and transparent. So this is just one example.
Mm-hmm. No, when I can't speak to that level of detail, but what I can say is that through the XR program and research fund that we put in place, which is a 2-year, $50 million investment program, is solely dedicated on, you know, external research on how to build, you know, these new technologies responsibly. So all of these considerations are, you know, obviously being taken into account, like from the design by default, from the early stages. But, you know, again, we are really at the very, very early days of this. And this is why, you know, again, we're soliciting feedback and we're being part of all of these conversations.
So we only have about a minute left, but very quickly, if I could ask you, how protective should we each be about our own data, whether it's putting your DNA out there for 23andMe to find out your ancestry, whether it's letting, you know, corporations get your information in terms of what you're clicking on to give you personalized ads. To what degree, given where we are right now, should we be as protective as we can or not? And Esther, let me start with you.
I think it's about consent and informed consent. I think the issue is that we give away our data, our DNA, without knowing and without having actually agreed to that and understanding what that actually means. So for me, informed consent through education is our start point.
I would agree with that. You know, the informed consent is important, but I think it's very, very important that we are careful because we see more and more cyber threat, and you know we have to be super careful what we click. So more from that angle, we cannot be careful enough, I think.
I would agree on, obviously, on the informed consent, also on the fact that this may look different for everybody. So I don't think there's really as a clear cut, you know, that can be drawn. I mean, it will be really up to, you know, each of us, the ones that have provided informed consent.
And Kyle, let me give you the last word here.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to a case-by-case basis of individuals, how comfortable you are, how familiar you are with what you're using, and how you aim to use it, and what then you're willing to feel comfortable potentially getting out to. I think that's it. The real question is not necessarily what is the use, but what might happen if something would occur that goes beyond where you're willing to share.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to the audience.
Thank you.